Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Balint Musitz.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
This is our podcast about sailing the East Coast of the United States. In some episodes, we focus on passages and destinations. In other episodes, we'll talk about boats, equipment, and techniques. And when we come across an interesting person, we'll try to get them as a guest on the show. Before we dive into this episode, we need to say a special thank you to our supporters. Several listeners have made a monthly financial contribution to support the podcast and help defray the cost of producing these episodes. We now have a Patreon page, so supporting the podcast is super easy. Just go to patreon.com/sailing the East.
Now, Bela, you mentioned earlier interesting people, and I think today we have some interesting people on. I'm excited to hear. Tell us who we're talking with today on the podcast.
Yeah, you're right, Mike. So they've been on the podcast before. This is a father and son team, Simon and Sawyer Balint. They were on the podcast back in episode 29. And they were the team that bought a boat a number of years ago, having zero sailing experience. They bought the boat in Florida, and I helped them move it from Florida up to Narragansett Bay. And so that was our first sailing experience together. We spent about 2 weeks doing that. And now they're taking that same boat and they're getting ready to go across the Atlantic in this boat. So it'll be their first sort of trip across the Atlantic. They've taken many trips on the East Coast. They have a lot of sailing hours and a lot of experience. But, you know, going across the Atlantic is sort of another level of a passage. And they're getting ready to do that. So this podcast was sort of a conversation about the preparation that has gone into for them to get ready to go across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, and Bela, like to me, okay, preparing just to go overnight is like a big deal, you know, right? So I can't even imagine what an Atlantic crossing in a 40-foot boat, right, would feel like. And, you know, we've had some long distance sailors on the podcast over the last few years, and you yourself have taken a few long trips, I know, but this seems like a pretty heavy lift to cross the Atlantic, isn't it?
I think it is, because you're really far away. Like I remember when we went from Nova Scotia to Baltimore on my friend's boat. One of the things that I paid attention to was I think the Coast Guard helicopter has about 150-mile range. So I wanted to make sure we were never more than 150 miles away from land.
I totally get that.
I mean, it's probably a false sense of security, but it was something that was important to me. Well, when you're going across the Atlantic, if something goes wrong, what's gonna happen is they're gonna divert a big freighter or a commercial ship to try to rescue you or give you aid. That's how that's going to work, right?
And who knows how long that'll take.
Right.
It's a big ocean. Right?
It's a big ocean, right? So anyway, you're out there. So it really speaks to, you know, self-reliance and being able to take care of yourself and being able to handle any situation that comes up, because you are out there on your own.
Yeah. And I mean, this is such a big kind of process to prepare for this. We broke this into 2 episodes, right, Bela? So this one is episode 84, and then part 2, which when we post that, you'll find as episode 85. But no, I think this is really interesting, Bela, and I think we should get right to it. What do you think?
Sounds good. Let's dive in, Mike.
Okay.
Hey, Sawyer, Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Bela. Nice to see you.
Yeah, same here. So I was trying to remember when you guys were on the podcast last, and it was episode 29.
Wow. Oldie.
Yeah.
Oldie.
Luckily, we didn't record video in those days, so people can't go back to compare how we have all aged. But this will be episode 83, I think, if I counted correctly.
Wow. Cool.
So
what was the last one? Was it when we were in the sort of a hurricane or a tropical storm situation?
Hang on. So let me look at my list. Were you guys on more than once?
I think we've been on twice, maybe 3 times.
I only have you down for 29. Episode
Maybe you cut
29.
you cut the early ones.
Well, you're probably thinking of the business podcast, Simon,
could
because
be.
you've been on that one a couple times.
Yep.
Yeah. But yeah, I only see you that one time. So anyway, welcome. I'm glad you guys are going to do this. And so we're going to talk about, the two of you are planning to sail across the Atlantic Ocean.
Correct.
This summer sometime.
Mm.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about, why you're doing that, sort of what you've done to the boat, talk a little bit about the boat, and then spend most of the time sort of talking about sort of the mental preparation that you have to go, the mental, the physical. It's just going to be two of you. So, you got to think about watches, how you're going to do all that kind of stuff, sort of the safety things that you're going to initiate. So that's sort of the things that I had on the docket to sort of talk about.
Cool.
Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure this right order, but let me just kind of update you is with the information that it's going to be Sawyer, my son, who is going to be turning 25 in a couple weeks. Myself, who just turned 50, and then we recruited my father. Actually, he's come out with us for the last year or two, kind of as a passenger, but he's gotten more and more into it.
Yeah.
And so he was thrilled. So it's going to be 3 generations, and
wow.
And then in a way it's 4 generations, and that's kind of a story too. So my grandmother and my father are both from England. My father was born there, and they came over in the late 50s. My dad was a kid. My grandmother was in her 30s. And my grandmother actually, she grew up on the south coast of England. Her family, a couple generations back, had a boatyard. Her great-great-grandfather was a naval captain. So she's always been sort of a person into boats. And when we were buying the boat, she was very interested in it. And anyway, she passed away a couple of years ago. But this year in July, she would have been 100. So we still have her ashes, and we're going to bring her back to her hometown. Our goal is to actually land in Worthing, UK, where she grew up and lived, and bring her back there. So it's actually, in a way, kind of 4 generations on the boat.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize your dad was coming along. That's fabulous.
Yeah.
And so this has, in addition to sort of being a huge accomplishment, it has a lot of personal meaning to you and your family as well.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe I would sort of talk about it. Well, I think one episode before, Bale, you kind of asked why we got into sailing, and I think at the time I had mentioned that one of the reasons was that Sawyer always loved boats, was obsessed with boats. When he was a little kid, like 4 years old, he would have a new favorite boat design every day that I had to look at with him. And as he got older, it became a little more challenging to find things that we could both be interested in, right?
Yeah.
When they're little, you're Superman, and when they get a little older, you gotta up your game, right? So we decided to buy this sailboat so we could kind of experience that together, and then that morphed into this. Wouldn't it be great if we could figure a way to sail together, to Europe as a father-son team? So that's that's the very personal aspect of it.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. So Sawyer, how do you feel like do you feel like the person most responsible for this the success of this particular journey?
I feel a little. First, I'll preface by saying that I was thinking of getting jackets like Star Trek. You could have navigation, engineering.
Yes.
I guess the engineering is the redcoats, right? So I think Simon.
No one wants to be a redcoat on this.
But he doesn't want to be the redcoat. And then there's science too, right? Maybe Peter can be science because he has a PhD. That's my grandfather. No, I think this time around it's been very very balanced, and part of the reason why is because there's less, in some kind of counterintuitive ways, there's actually a lot less trip planning involved from a navigation perspective than there is on some of the work that we had done. So, Bailey, you had joined us when you bought the boat in Florida, and we're trying to motor it up the ICW and then sail,
right,
along the coast all the way up to Annapolis. And there's a lot of trip planning involved in that, right? Like planning the tides and, lock times and distances
Si-
between marinas.
I don't remember doing any of that trip planning. Do you, Simon?
I remember getting the readout.
Yes, I remember getting
of,
the sheet of paper that said here it is.
Yeah, actually, I remember Sawyer and I only had a float plan. He actually would make a video.
That's right.
With the map, and then day by day, and with the little icon of the boat traveling. So.
I remember that.
So this time around, we don't. I mean, it's just the ocean. There wasn't anything to hit.
Yeah.
We're just going to be sailing east, and there is going to be a lot of planning that happens when we get closer, and that's going to be weather dependent. But we can't make weather-based decisions until a couple of days before we leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that once we get offshore, it'll be. I certainly plan to be very involved in the weather planning aspect of it and making those course changes. But in the lead up to it, most of the preparation for this has been, the logistics that we didn't have to think about so much in our past, right? Like, we need to make sure we, have enough food to be out there for 3 weeks. We need to make sure that our electrical system, can sustain itself, for 3 weeks without motoring all the time. Whereas, you were staying with us, we'd motor all day long, and that wasn't a concern. Make sure we have enough water, and we have the ability to make water now. Whereas when we were with you, we would just pop into a marina after a couple of days. So a very different way of prioritizing our thinking compared to some of the coastal stuff that we had done before.
Right.
And I would say too that another big, maybe what I've been more involved in is the process of thinking about the critical systems and what systems could fail, and then how to build in redundancies for those systems. Again, when we're doing coastal cruising, you're not usually more than a few hours away from some sort of help or getting towed into a marina or something like that.
Right.
And in this case, no one's coming right for us. So we've really thought about those systems, and maybe I hope have done a pretty good job of planning for redundancy. So we actually have like 5 different ways to steer the boat and 6 different sails. We added another stay so we could sail in different kind of conditions, and 4 different ways to communicate with the outside world. If one fails, we've got another one. So that's been a different kind of approach for us.
Yeah. Yeah. The I did some podcast with a guy who left Burlington, Vermont, him and his wife, and they tripped down to the Bahamas, and he's been on several episodes. And he kept saying, they didn't teach me this when I took my ASA sailing course, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff like you're describing right now that you don't get in a typical sailing course about redundancy and these safety systems, and even meal preparation for 3 weeks, and all of these things. That's not part of sort of the normal curriculum, right? They tell you about keep the red buoys on the right and the green ones on the left. They tell you that kind of stuff. So where have you kind of learned these things?
I mean, I think a lot of it's just been through the process of owning this boat for 5 years, right? And
I was going to say that, sorry, too, that we've only for about 5 years, but we've spent a lot of time on that boat, Sawyer and I, as a team. We've gone about 6,000, nautical miles, and I did the math at some point. It was like 2,000 or plus hours on the boat or something like that. And when we're on the boat, Sawyer and I, this is what we talk about all the time and think about and conceptualize and kind of, do some scenario planning and what ifs. And even, we do drills sometimes, we do man overboard drills, or we do drills where we need to try to anchor with no engine. And so I think that's certainly part of it. And then, reading, watching YouTube, of course, talking to people. I've talked to a couple of folks who've crossed the Atlantic and kind of asked them, what was a surprise to them. And actually, one of them talked about food. Just kind of planning. That person went with a larger crew. It was a race, and how do you feed 8 people for 20 days, right?
Right.
So we've learned from some folks, but we're definitely going to learn a lot
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. There are various different rallies that people join to sail across oceans, and they're sort of loosely organized, and they provide some sort of safety net and some sort of advice. Did you guys think about doing that, or was this just something you guys wanted to do kind of solo, I'll call it?
Yeah, I think for this one, we've certainly discussed the idea of a rally, and we might keep tabs on what the rallies are doing. A lot of their communication is still on the SSB, and so if we can find their channel, we'll probably listen in on what they're up to. But no, I think we want to do this one alone. We have a lot of flexibility that way. From a safety net perspective, we're not. If we're going to get rescued out in the middle of the ocean, it's probably going to be from a container ship. It's probably not going to be from another sailboat.
Right.
We have, a variety of different communication tools that allow us to facilitate that evacuation if it needs to happen. With or without, chatting with the rally organizer on the SSB.
Right. Right. So let's remind folks a little bit about the boat. What is the boat? And give me some of the highlights of the things that you've done to it to sort of get it ready for this big journey.
Sure. All right. So it's a 1989 Passport 40. It's a Bob Perry design, and so 40 feet long. And when we bought it, it was in really good aesthetic condition. It wasn't really equipped for blue water sailing, I would say. It spent most of its life in the Bahamas, and then the coast of Florida, and so that was kind of it was equipped for that type of sailing, right? 1 or 2 day passages. The previous owner had sailed it up to Maine coastally, but yeah, nothing super far offshore. And so then over the past 5 years, we've slowly been adding equipment to it, often based on needs that we identify as we're sailing. So as an example, we find that sailing downwind can be kind of hard under the previous arrangement. We just had a Genoa and a Maine. The Maine doesn't. It's kind of hard to sail wing on wing because the spreaders come back, right? So you can't let the boom out all the way. So now we're just trying to sail downwind with the Genoa, and the Genoa doesn't stay full on its own, and so we end up not really being able to sail downwind. Obviously, a boat can't sail straight into the wind either. So your actual sailing angle ends up only being 90 degrees on either side. So we installed a whisker pole a couple of years ago ourselves, and that has been a huge quality of life improvement. It's a little bit of a time investment to get it started. Go up on deck and rig it. But once you do, it just completely expands our sailing capabilities. We installed a monitor self-steering wind vane, thinking about electrical redundancy in terms of steering the boat. And our electrical autopilot, as Balint knows from experience, is not the most reliable, and it's also very loud. And then we've all, not only just installing it, but then also taking the time to really learn how to use it. I think last summer we didn't really use the autopilot at all. We spent the whole summer long just sailing with the wind vane.
I think we haven't really used that autopilot in a couple of years. In fact, we gotta practice with that again.
Make sure we know what the buttons do.
Yeah.
I had a few other ones. I was actually just down there a couple of weeks ago with the surveyor because we wanted to have the boat kind of looked at from a third party, and make sure we were all set. So a couple of the other items on that list were obviously a water maker. We added that to give us some more fresh water on our trip. We added the a Solon stay this winter. So that we have a roller furler head stay, which is convenient, but although folks say you can furl that head stay, it doesn't really perform very well, and you can't reduce it that much. So to put in a heavy weather sail, either a smaller jib or a storm jib, it's not really practical on a roller furler. So we added this extra stay that runs parallel to it. It's actually a removable stay with Dyneema, and we bought two new sails, a 90% or 87%, whatever, and then and a storm jib, so we can fly those as well. And I think that's going to give us a lot of extra options.
Yeah.
We bought a bunch of other safety equipment too. So we bought a large Paratech sea anchor that kind of oversized, so it hopefully would kind of stop the boat if we needed to. With the idea being, we're exhausted, or someone's hurt, or the engine's not working, or whatever, and we just need to kind of pause. We could, ideally throw out the sea anchor, go bow into the weather, and to kind of regroup. And then on the other side of the boat, we bought a Jordan series drogue, and that would hopefully help us in a heavy weather situation where we want to slow the boat down.
Yeah.
And there's just a long list of things we bought too. But
yeah. So what are you guys doing for power generation?
Yeah, that's one that I've spent a little bit of time thinking about. So when we bought the boat, it had about 300 watts of solar that were stitched into the canvas bimini top. So what somebody had done is they had taken like flexible stick-on solar panels and stuck them onto that like plastic corrugated cardboard, and then had stitched that kind of composite into the bimini top, and then run the wires down the backstay. It did not provide a whole lot of power. I think maybe it provided more power when those panels were new. They're certainly not new anymore. But it was never a big concern for us because we, coastal sailing, we're using the engine pretty frequently. And it actually did provide plenty of power for when we're sailing at anchor. I think what we found sailing on our own is that, sailing overnight with all the nav equipment and the radar, potentially the autopilot if we're not using the wind vane, it just consumes a lot of power. And so I actually coded up a little model in Python to try and understand our electrical usage, and then testing different assumptions for how much power we would need, with certain amounts of sunlight to satisfy all of our electrical requirements. And we were nowhere close. I mean, we really needed double the solars that we had, and where are we going to put that? So we kind of kicked the can down the road. That was a few years ago. But in preparation for this trip, mostly Simon is building this big hard Dodger, or hard bimini top, I should say, out of mahogany and plywood. And he can talk more about the details of that. But then on top of that, we're going to put 600 watts of solar panels, and those are going to be hard 200 watt 12 volt panels that we just got on Amazon.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so it's double the capacity, from factory spec, but I think in reality we're going to see our output go substantially higher than that, because those old flexible panels were not producing their rated output at all.
Yeah. Now, will 600 watts give you enough that you need yourself? Is it self-sustaining, or you're going to still have to run the engine? Because you don't have a generator, I don't think, correct?
No, we don't have a generator. The 600 watts will certainly provide enough power if we're not using the autopilot.
Very good.
What we found is that we mostly use the autopilot when we're using the engine, right? Because the wind vane doesn't work if there's no wind. And that's when we're running the engine.
Right.
So yeah, so we're pretty optimistic on that front.
Nice. So Simon, let's talk about this mahogany. You're quite the woodworker. I've seen some samples of your work. It's quite intriguing. So let's talk about this mahogany. Is it a bimini or a Dodger?
Well, I think, everyone always says hard Dodgers. I've never heard people say hard bimini, but that's really what it is, right? So it's like the roof, which is hard. And then we still have a vinyl and canvas windshield Dodger, which is attached to the forwardmost stainless steel arch, and then that's attached to the hard bimini. So anyway, yeah, it's the roof, if you will. And it's one of those things that we had sort of an idea for what we needed, and then but as you start building it, if you're going to be putting all the effort, you might as well make it look good, right? So it kind of the project kind of expands from there. So it's so it's made of tongue and groove beadboard mahogany that I milled down to a thickness that was still strong but would reduce some weight.
Mm-hmm.
And those are together, and then running across that on the top is okume, I guess you call it, marine plywood, and then that's glassed, so it's got fiberglass, and then 3 more layers of epoxy. And then what I'm going to do tonight after we finish talking is probably put the all grip primer on the top and then start all gripping it. So it's getting close. This is a long day for me this morning. So I'm a little bit of I can be impatient, when it comes to these kind of projects. So I had this whole thing planned out, and I wanted to build it in our shop. We have a 2-story shop, and that's where I got all the tools. And I started building it, and it was looking really big, like it doesn't look. I wouldn't think it would be that big on the boat, but when you're inside, it's starting to look really, really big. So my mom actually said, "Are you sure it's going to fit down the stairs?" And I was like, "Ah, no problem." But anyway, so when she left, I took a tape measure and I measured it. And according to my measurements, I had about 3/4 of an inch to spare. And so anyway, this morning we took it off the buck, which helps to form it. And a guy and I lifted it, and we started to try to move it down the stairs. And we were off by like a foot. It wasn't even close to going down. And so what I had done is, and this is if Sawyer was with me, he would have known this right off the bat, right? So I measured this like line, right? This like hypotenuse, but obviously the roof is not a line; it's a plane, so it doesn't, all want to squeeze down there. And I was probably after more like 2 feet, 18 inches. So now what? So I looked around. It's a brick building, an old broom factory. So there are a couple pretty large windows, but it still wouldn't fit out those. So I was gonna maybe try to take the bricks out and get it out there, but it's heavy, and I needed to then lower it down, to the ground floor. But then I checked out the joists that were, at the far end of the stairs, and there were a couple that I'm pretty sure weren't structural. But just to be sure,
We'll find out.
Yeah, well, just be sure. Actually, I stopped and I ran to Home Depot and I got a bunch of 2x10s. And so I was ready to put something back in if I need to. And I got my Sawzall and I cut out two joists and about 4 feet of floor, and was able to get it down by, again, half an inch. It's out onto my trailer. It got home. It's in my garage, and that's the hard part. So now I'm ready to paint it.
Yeah, boy, that's quite the story. So how does this attach to the boat?
We got a couple different plans for how that's going to be done. We bought a bunch of different hardware, and we'll see what actually works best. We've got the typical, I think most people have when they have like a bimini or the pulpit rails. It's that 1-inch stainless steel tubing.
Right.
That's sort of the structure. So we modified that to create a couple different arches around the cockpit, and then we bought sort of clamshell hardware that goes around that tubing, and then it's got a 1/4 inch by 20 thread count machine screw or bolt that can go through it, and so our plan is to bolt through from the top down.
I see.
Using some backing plates or large washers down into those clam cleats. But we'll, maybe we'll have a ratchet strap at some point on the trip. We're definitely going to bring a couple in case.
Like we did for the dinghy. Yeah. I remember that ratchet strap for the dinghy.
I think it's going to work, and it's going to so it's going to provide us good platform for the solar panels, which we're excited about. Yeah. We're also going to set up, and sorry, he was working on today, basically a whole series of kind of redundant communication systems on that hard bimini. So, for example, right, typically your VHF antenna is on the top of your mast, which is great. It gets a little bit better range, right? But if we were to lose our mast, we would lose our antenna. So we bought a third radio. We're putting a third full radio in the cockpit with its own antenna on the hard bimini, and then our other main radio, of course, is down below using the mast. So that's one example of what this new hard bimini is going to do for us.
Nice.
Yeah,
nice.
Bela, unbelievable story, and we're only halfway through this one. So, what struck you most as most interesting the first part of the story?
Well, I think there's this nice family aspect to it of father, son, and grandson, right? So it's actually Simon's dad is coming along on the trip. So it'll be Simon's dad, Simon, and Simon's son, Sawyer. So it's 3 generations. And as Simon talked about, they also have the ashes of Simon's father's mom that they're taking back to where she was born, and going to spread her ashes back in the UK, where she was from and where she's born. So there's that sort of it has purpose, right? It has a purpose beyond just checking off, hey, I sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. It's got this real purpose to it, which I think is really kind of neat. And I think that really gives it special meaning to those people involved in sort of this trip. And so I thought that was a really, really cool part of it.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed, I mean, I've been so fortunate, Bela, to have known so many amazing people in my almost 56 years on the planet, and getting to know people's families and my own family too, of course, but that, really cool, strong families have some glue that holds them together, right? Maybe it's a shared love of cooking, or, maybe it's sports. I know, like, my in-laws, baseball was with the glue that really held them together for a long time, these shared experiences. And this trip seems like this cool glue that holds this family together. And every family, as you know well, that hits tough times and bumps in the road and things happen. But when you have these shared experiences, to me, it really seems like something that can really keep a family together. Now, you're also a 3-generation sailing family, right? I know that you've got this boat and your kids and now your grandkids. We've talked about this a lot. So can you relate to kind of this value of this? And could you imagine doing something like this at some point with the 3 generations in your family?
Well, I don't think I can imagine sailing across the Atlantic. I think that's more than I want to bite off. But I will tell you, we've done week-long, right, with 3 generations on the boat, with my son and his kids, and it really is special, right? It has this, again, it has this sort of additional meaning and additional value to above and beyond just going to sailing. For me, it's almost a spiritual thing, right? It's sort of this shared experience that's not a shared experience that you do every day. And it's sort of a special thing. It brings special meaning to it. And I'll tell you, my 2 granddaughters, who are ages 9 and 7 now, last year they spent a week on the boat with just Elaine and I, and they coined that Camp Paradox. So this year, right, hey, Pop, when we going to have Camp Paradox?
Awesome.
Right? So, I mean, that's what, hey, to me, that's what life's all about. Right.
Yep.
When those types of things happen, I say to myself, buying the boat was a great thing. And you can you don't have to buy a boat to have these types of experiences. You have to figure out how to make opportunities so you can have experiences like this, whether they be, in your backyard or at your house. You can make these special things happen.
Right. Or you spend $20 and take them bowling. You know what I mean? Right.
Right.
Once
Exactly.
You have a family bowling tournament, right? It can be simple and easy. Or horseshoes in the back. I don't think they do horseshoes anymore because the kids get hit in the head, but you know what I mean, right? Something inexpensive, badminton or something that you can pick up for $20 at Target, kind of thing, and make it an annual tradition. I love it.
That's right. Those are the things that are very meaningful and important. So I think that's great. And I think this is going to be, for Simon and his family, is going to be one of those moments that everyone will cherish and remember forever.
Love it. Now let's move into the preparation issues, because this was fascinating to me as kind of the non-sailor. Is what do you have to do? I can't even imagine doing it, but once you kind of get over this thing of thinking about being on a boat with your dad and your kid, right, for all this time under all these conditions, you have to get ready, and it's a long process. What do you think are the most important elements of the prep that listeners should really be paying special attention to for anybody who's even remotely thinking about something like this?
So I think there's three aspects to this. There's sort of the boat and the equipment, making sure that everything, is functioning and you have all the equipment you need. And we can talk, about safety equipment and communication equipment. And then there's sort of the preparation of your mind and body, because this is going to be, to your mind and body, a totally new experience. I don't care if you've been out, for 3 or 4 days cruising on the coast of the East Coast. This is sort of different. I can remember coming back from Nova Scotia, right? It's just 4 days and you're just out there, and it was a different experience. And the other, so I think you got to think about preparing your mind and your body and the boat and the equipment. So those are sort of the categories. I think one of the big things is this notion of redundant systems. I think about this, and I think there's a lot of shared processes and things that you can learn from the aircraft industry or from the airline industry, right? Where they have 3 sets of radios. They have all this redundant stuff, because when they're up in the air, they're sort of on their own, and they got to figure out how to make this thing work and bring it into port, so to speak. And this is the same. So you have to have redundancy in your systems. So what are the things you got to have to do? You have to have a solid hull in a boat that doesn't leak, so that stays afloat, right? You got to figure out, how can I make sure my boat keeps floating? Number one. And number two, how can I make sure I have some kind of propulsion that I can go in the direction the wind is going to blow me? Because eventually I'll hit land, and then I got to have enough food and water to survive. And those are sort of the fundamental basic things. So think about, what sort of things do I need to do to ensure that my boat is watertight, right? The first thing they do after they make this beautiful hull out of fiberglass on a boat is they drill a bunch of holes in it.
Doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. So I have all these holes in my boat. Now, if one of those fittings breaks off, how am I going to stop the water from coming in? Right. Those are the types of things I got to think about. And, it's one thing if that happens to me in Narragansett Bay, because I'm not going to die. But if I'm in the middle Atlantic Ocean, it's a lot more serious. So there's those types of things.
What about the weather? They talked a lot more about weather planning and exit routes and things like this. I mean, how is that? I mean, intuitively, I kind of get that it's a much bigger deal, but maybe you could explain to me a little bit why that's such a big deal going across the ocean versus a shorter trip.
Well, on a shorter trip, the weather forecast for the next 3 days is pretty darn accurate. I can go sail down the coast, the East Coast someplace. I can be out for 3 days, and I know I'm not going to hit any big storms, because I might get a thunderstorm, but that's going to last 20 minutes. It's no big deal. But I'm not going to get a hurricane, right? I'm not going to get a big low that's going to really churn over top of me for 3 or 4 days, because the forecast for the 3 or 4 day horizon is really good. I mean, it's gotten really, really good. Yeah, they might say the winds are going to be 15 miles an hour and they turn out to be 20 miles an hour, but that's round off error when it comes to this kind of stuff. But when the trip's taking you 15 to 20 days and you only have a 3 or 4 day weather horizon, and there's no real exit, right? There's no, it's not like I'm 10 miles offshore. When I'm going up and down the East Coast and something happens or some storm is coming, probably within a day at the longest, I can be in port if something happens to me. But that's the longest that it'll take me to get into port. Well, out there, there's no place for me to go. So there are these things called weather routers. There's companies that you can hire, which is basically a meteorologist. You tell them where you want to go, when you want to leave. And they will give you weather reports, and they do it on a periodic basis, and you can decide whether you want one every day, you want one every 3 days, or whatever. And so what they can do is they can make adjustments to the direction that you go in. So they can say, you know what, I know you're trying to get to the Azores, but you know what, we're going to deviate a little bit more further north because there's this storm churning down south, and we're going to try to avoid and stay away from that. Or we want to avoid and stay away from it, and we want to take advantage of the winds that storm is doing, right? So when you're far away from a storm, you can take advantage of some of those winds. They can help move you in the direction you want to go. So there's that kind of deviation that you can make in your course, but there's really no exit as there is when you're doing coastal cruising. So I think that's the biggest difference. And I think it's very wise to hire one of these weather routers. I know Simon and Sawyer did, and every 3 days they get an updated weather report that tells them what's going on, what to expect for the next 3 or 4 days. And it also then helps you prepare to say, hey, day after tomorrow is going to get really windy. so get ready for that. Make sure you're well rested, right? Make sure you're well fed, kept good nutrition and hydration and stuff, because you might have a rough day or two coming. So I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah. What about the other question I had for you is, Simon made a part for his boat, and you said, okay, talented woodworker, et cetera, which is great. But is that something people do? Do people like build their own stuff for their boat, or is this a little bit uncommon?
I think it's a little bit uncommon. So he built what's called a hard dodger. So on my boat, I have a dodger made out of canvas, right? It's got aluminum frame, and it's canvas, and it's got clear plastic windows so I can see through it. But basically what it does, it's like the windshield of a car. Think of yourself in a convertible, right? And it's the windshield of the car. And what he did is he built a roof for the car.
Hard top, right?
A hard top. And that's mainly to stay out of the weather, right? So in my boat, if it rains, I'm getting wet. If I'm in the cockpit, I'm getting wet. Well, if you have a hard dodger and you can put sides on it, you can stay dry. And comfort is an important aspect of keeping your mind and body, in good shape.
Solid.
For something like this. So I think it's rare that people do that it's not unheard of, but it's most people don't do that, right? But Simon said, hey, I want a hard dodger on here. And I think it's wise. I mean, he's got the skill and the talent to do it. And I think it'll be great.
And he can get it it sounds like he got it just the way he wanted it. And he made the adjustment for the antennas and things like this, right? This is kind of cool, right?
Right.
So fascinating. And then kind of the last question about that I had in my head for you is like, okay, if you put something like this on your boat, does it affect the aerodynamics at all? Does it slow you down? I mean, I know we talked about weight, and so there's some weight issues, but is it just a matter of some extra weight, or is there anything else there that you need to kind of will it change the way the boat sails, essentially?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, Mike, but I don't think it's going to add anything appreciable or anything that you're going to notice. It's his boat's a heavy boat. It weighs, I think it's like 29,000 pounds.
Right. So another couple hundred pounds for this thing.
Right. A couple 100 pounds. It's not going to add. Now it will add windage, right? So if the wind is blowing, it adds sort of windage. And one of the things you do when you're in a storm is you try to take everything down that you can to reduce the amount of windage you have. So you really can't take this down. It's up there.
Right. It's hard. It's hard.
My Dodger, I can take off my Dodger. I can take off my Bimini. This is up there. So that may be the slight thing that you might want to consider, but I don't think it's a big deal.
But out in the middle of the Atlantic, it's trade-offs, right? And I get it. So it's like, okay, to be dry and to have this feeling that you're a little bit in control of your environment when you're not, right, is probably worth that little bit of extra kind of windage or the risk when you're in a storm.
Yeah, I agree.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good. So what do you think? Wrap this one up, and looking forward to part 2, which will be episode 85. Listeners, thanks for joining us for another episode. And obviously, Bela and I thought this was really interesting, and we hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking as well. As always, if you have questions about what we've talked about, please feel free to get in touch with us. The best way is by email, sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
Hey, and if you enjoyed the podcast, hit that follow button on your podcasting application and tell your friends about it. like to get some more listeners. That's always fun to do. So hope to see you out there. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you all soon.
Bela, thanks from over here in Münster, Germany. I look forward to seeing you next time.